So there we are. Thank you all for joining, and hopefully this is your second time where you're coming here. A couple of weeks ago we started building this API, and today we're going to continue working on this API. Just let me give you an overview like what we did last time and like what are the plans for today. We also had like a poll in the chat asking you like on what we should work today, and I'll get back into that in a second. But if you're watching this live, let me know in the comment section if you can hear me all right. That will help a lot. And meanwhile, I will start here with the API. And actually, I think the best way to like visualize what we did so far is to jump into Postman. And what we did so far is essentially we have defined 3 endpoints. And the purpose of this API is essentially to be like a Twitter clone. So it should give users the possibility of creating tweets or reading tweets and things like that. So the most basic endpoint that we have created was the status endpoint. So the status endpoint simply comes back and says, okay, status is up. So the API is working. Then we have also built tweets endpoint. And here with this tweets endpoint, we are essentially just getting the list of tweets. And of course, we have also created our first post endpoint with a JSON payload. And at that point, we kind of discovered the fact that we are not doing any authentication. And it kind of brings us to today's topic and what we're trying to add to this API. And that is to give users a way to register with this API, and also to give us a way to verify in the backend that when someone is posting a tweet or a message pretending to be Bill Gates, that user is actually allowed to do that. So for that reason, we're gonna jump back here into the code and try to make some changes to it. So as you see, here are the endpoints that we have developed so far. So this is the status endpoint, the tweets endpoints, and the post endpoint. And for this, we have used Express, super easy to use. As you have seen, with just a few lines of code, we already managed to create some pretty powerful functionality for this API altogether. And as a storage, we have used a file-based database. So that's LowDB, and we went into that a bit also. And this is how our database looks at this point. It's not a relational database, it's just simply storing this in a JSON file. We'll try to understand a bit like what are the advantages or disadvantages of this throughout the live stream. So yes, that's the plan for today. And hope that you will be able to follow along today as well. And yeah, let's begin by thinking about authentication and how we can bring this to the API. Now, generally, authenticating an API is not really a simple topic, but for the purpose of today, we're going to try and simplify it as much as possible. And what we're going to do here is we're going to take a look at essentially start with designing this. So we know that we haven't provided users a way to register here, right? So because we haven't provided that registration possibility, users cannot really provide any authentication information because they are not registered in the first place. So what I would recommend, or what I would propose to do, is to start thinking about how can we first let people register. And what we're going to do here is we're going to create here a new endpoint. And I'm going to start directly from Postman just to get a feeling like what kind of data we need, how would we like this API to behave before we write any kind of code inside it. So I'm simply going to duplicate here post request, because it's definitely going to be a post request when you are sending some data. So let's say register user, right? So we're trying to register some users. and we're providing here with a post request because we need some data. We're going to talk about that in a second. We need some data, and we need to provide an endpoint. So where should this data go? Now, because we're trying to create a user, it does make sense to name this endpoint users, right? So users will essentially be the resource holding the users. With a post request, we are adding a new user to the list, essentially, right? So going to the body itself, well, we have to think a bit about the naming and what kind of data is here required. So, for example, we could associate with a user like, okay, tell me what is your username. So which username would you like to have? So we can say here, okay, one property would be username, right? Another property would be, for example, let's require users to provide us with an email. So we could have here an email address as well. So let's start here, for example, with John Doe and leave Bill Gates out of this example. Okay, so we're providing a username. This will be needed later on. You have seen here, we have used it in the tweets. So every tweet has essentially a username. We call it user. Maybe username is a better term for that. And we have also requested an email, right? So essentially this is already looks pretty decent in terms of what we're trying to do. So what we're trying to do here is let's send this request, and of course it's not gonna work. So we will see here 404 not found, cannot post to users. So that's obviously not working very well. I think there are a few people who are complaining about the quality of the stream. So let's take a look into that, see why that may be an issue. I'm not sure if the quality of the video is something that's that only some people have, or nobody sees what I have on the screen. I'm streaming with the highest quality possible, and this session is also recorded, so it's also possible that the recording itself will have a better quality than the stream right now. Not sure why this is happening right now. So I think if you manually go to the stream and select the higher quality, you should see 1080p being displayed. And at least on the monitor that I have here, the quality is all right. But I do apologize for not being able to follow along so far. So to check that setting inside your player, see if you can get a nicer screen. And anyway, so far we have just, we haven't gotten into coding. So this is where the coding part starts. All right, so I guess the next step would be to actually go back to Glitch and define this endpoint, and take this user information that's available here and store it in our database. So the easiest way to do that would be to simply copy the previous endpoint that we have. And let's say here, register user. So that's gonna be the name of the user. And the endpoint is users, right? And let's redefine this variable in new user. And the kind of data that we're gonna get, we can look again what we have inside Postman. So I'm gonna get the username. So let's call this username, and we're gonna get from the request body the username and also the email. We're gonna get this from the body as well. So this is pretty similar to what we did before. So I'm not going too much into this. And additionally here we'll have DB data users, and we're gonna push here the new user, right? So let's go ahead and take a look at the database in a second. So let's try first to submit this to see if it's working properly. So I'm gonna get here an error, cannot read property of undefined. So essentially this database currently doesn't know anything about the users, right? So we have here the tweets, but there are no users. So we could try and directly write to the database. I'm gonna create a new key here, users, and initialize it with an empty array. This is auto-saved by glitch. So let's give it another try, see if this works. And we're gonna get back here message created. Let's also try. Sometimes this file is not uploaded, is not updated instantly, so we may get an issue for that. All right. But so far, at least we knew that we have pushed this tweet here. Oh, tweet. Oh, what's in my head? We pushed the user here. We have written it to the database. We haven't gotten any errors. So at least from this point of view, it seems to be all right. I'm gonna come back and check that file again. There's also the possibility of simply opening here the terminal, just in case the UI is not working properly. This can also give us like an insight, like what's happening with our database. And yeah, if I'm just running the cat command on this, we'll see that now we have a registered user here in the database. So far so good. Now here's the spoiler. We're not done with this endpoint at this point. This is simply not enough. We have realized that, you know, in the previous endpoint, it's not enough because you can essentially impersonate anyone. And here I can also tell you it is not enough. And why is it not enough? Well, for example, let's say, for example, someone is providing an invalid address, right? So it's not at example.com, it's without a valid address. We're gonna say, okay, great, thank you, created. Second of all, we now have 2 entries for the username John Doe in our database. So again, we haven't verified if that username already exists there, right? We haven't verified if the email is valid, and we're gonna see if there's anything else that we still need to verify. So from that point of view, we still got a bit of work to do. So before we can actually start getting this data here and pushing it to the database, we have to essentially validate. So we're gonna write here what they're called validators, right? So for example, let's try to validate the username. So I'm gonna go ahead, validate username. So how do we validate the username? So in order to see if the specific username given, in this case John Doe, already exists in our database of registered users, we first have to do a search into the database to see if there's anything like that inside there. So in order to do that, probably gonna simply take a look at how we did something like that here where we got the tweets. So of course we still have to do a database search. So we're gonna use the DB object, and on the DB object, what we're gonna do here is we're gonna get the users, right? So we can get the users, and there's also the possibility of using some built-in functions, and one of these is find. So we can specify here some criteria for finding this. We're gonna get into that in a second. And we're gonna also extract the value by calling the value function. So, and here we also have to add a chain in order to chain this entire, to essentially get all these functions to work together. So you can a bit ignore it, but essentially we're getting from the users, we're specifying a condition, and then we're saying, okay, give me what you have found, right? And this will only give us a value. So we have to look into the database. So based on which condition do you want to get something? Well, the condition will be the username, right? So I'm gonna search for something that is the username, and let me close this window so that we have a bit more space here. So we have here the username, and we're gonna search if this username already exists. So we could use here new user, username, and just as well we have used a request body username, but it's essentially the same thing, right? So we're getting this value here, and what we could do here is let's put everything in an if block. So this will be a condition, but just in case you're not sure like what you're getting back, can also simply go ahead and say something like existing user, right? So we're getting here the existing user, just to verify if this entire thing that we have written here is even working. And we can use something like console.log and put a value here. And I'm simply gonna comment this. I don't want to add so many entries in the database that are not working anyway. So what we can do here is from the tools, we can open up the logs. Currently, the only logs that we have is that the API is listening on port 3000. This is coming from here. All right, so let's resubmit. So let's go ahead and resubmit this request. Oh, we're also getting some errors. So 500 internet server error. It's an error that I totally love. And the idea here is to try to understand like what's happening and what's going on and why is this failing. And it's just part of the development process to understand what's happening. So cannot read property get of undefined. Okay, so obviously chain is here somehow undefined, and we have to look a bit into why this is undefined. As far as I remember, let's take a look here at LowDB. See if we have anything missing. db.chain. Okay, so we still need to import Lodash in order to use this chain functionality. So that seems to be the error here. So let's add this here at the top. I'm gonna give it a second. We're still getting some errors here. So cannot find package Lodash. So obviously this is not coming from LowDB. So we're gonna go to the package.json and we have to add a new package. So let's simply search for this package, install it. Taking a minute to deploy it again. And fingers crossed. Okay, so the app status is again okay. Going back to the server.js file, opening here the logs, just to take a look at what has happened. Okay, so going back here inside Postman, let's resubmit this request. And we're still getting here an error. So we're gonna try and fix that as well. So apparently this is still undefined. So probably there's still some additional settings that we need to do here. Probably the best way is to, so what do we have here? db.data needs to be initialized between low-chain is called. So we're running this on the database. This is just some, this library is making our lives a bit easier in terms of chaining this data and doing all these searches. So we have here the database. So it says database needs to be initialized. So I would assume that at this point, using this would be a good point in time to actually get these libraries together and to have them working. Okay, so now we got rid of this error. I've used this library in the past, so I'm kind of like familiar, but there's like always this initial setup that you need to do and to get something to work. But now that it's working, you're probably not gonna worry about this again for the rest of this tutorial. But yeah, just as a quick recap, in order to use db chain, essentially using this powerful API from Lodash, as it's nicely explained here, and then we are essentially querying the users, we're specifying some criteria, and at the end we're using value. This is also important to execute the entire chain that we have created. So we are chaining these commands together. This is why it's called a chain. Okay, and at least from a readability point of view, once this is working, it's relatively easy to understand what's going on, right? Okay, so we can see here in the console that what we did is actually working. So we have created this existing user variable, and you'll see we have used this command to search the database, and we have found something, right? Now, because we have found something, this is a bit problematic because we don't want to find anything, and if we find something, we don't want to let people continue, right? So this is the point where we need to create here an if block. So with the if block, so if existing user, and this is a very weak if, but if existing user is somehow true, if it contains something, what we want to do here at this point is to simply stop the execution, right? So in order to stop the execution of this function, the first thing we need to do is add here a return, right? So return will simply stop the execution. So we are inside this callback function that starts here essentially, and it ends here. So we need to tell, in this case, if the existing user is true, then first of all, we want to stop. Second of all, we don't just want to stop. What I want to do here at this point is to also tell the client, so inside Postman, well, there's a problem there, right? So we're gonna use here response dot status, and we're gonna return here status 400. Now 400 simply means bad request, right? So bad request always tells the user, well, there's a problem with what you have sent. So some of all of the values that you have provided, most of the time in the body, but sometimes also as parameters, are invalid. Now just sending back a 400 is not really so useful, right? So just give me a second. So at this point, if you're just sending back a status 400, it's not telling the person sending this data, like, what's the problem with it? Why did I do it wrong? So for example, we have here in the request, we have sent a username, or we have also sent an email. We're just sending back 400. Well, where is the problem? Is the username the problem? Is the email the problem? Is something else the problem? Were there any other parameters that I needed to submit as well, which I haven't submitted? So for that reason, it always makes sense to be a bit more specific in what we're sending back. So we can also add to our response, pretty similar to the way we did it here, right? So just gonna replicate this. Response send, we can send here a message, or we can call it error. Message error, both work. So what's the problem here? Well, the problem is that, what's the problem? Well, essentially the username exists. So username already taken, right? So username already taken. So if the username is already taken, we want to send this back. So let's see. Going back, let's try my John Doe user once again, and getting back 400 bad request. And I'm also getting back a message, username already taken. That's good. So what else can go wrong with this one? Well, here's another example. What's happening here? Let's say I'm gonna remove it completely, otherwise it's not valid JSON. So let's say I'm not submitting the username at all. So what's the script doing? Well, it's searching the database for something that doesn't exist, right? So this property hasn't been defined. It cannot find it in the database. It doesn't go here, and it's saying, oh, okay, this seems like a valid username, so we can send it, right? And again, it's not really what we wanted. It's not what we need at this point. So for this one, we also have to define some rules for the username, like what constitutes a valid username. And there can be many rules, but let's just say the most simple rule is that, you know, your username must contain at least 2 letters, right? So 2 characters. Also, you know, this can be like many characters, and we really have to be careful if you want to essentially accept all characters. So for example, this can also be a username if we say that we accept 2 characters. But probably if we're just trying to get into validating the username, this will definitely occupy this entire stream. But this just goes to show like really how complicated is data validation, and how many things need to be considered like before you write even a line of code in order to understand like what constitutes a valid username for the application that we're building. So let's keep it simple again. So we're gonna simply create another if block here, and we're essentially gonna almost replicate what we have here above. So what we have here, again, we're sending back response status 400. We're sending a message here. Well, what is the message? Well, the message probably should be something like invalid username. It's gonna be a bit unspecific, but still pretty enough. So at least what we're trying to do here is let's take here new user.username. I'm gonna take it through 2 checks. So first of all, I'm gonna check if new username exists, first of all, yeah. And if it exists, probably we should try something like checking the length. So checking the length. Let's see here. Strings do have a length property. And let's say if this is smaller than 2, we don't want to accept it. Of course, the way I've written it here, we have to negate everything. So invalid username is when new user username doesn't exist, or, so we don't use and, we use or. So I'm gonna use these 2 pipes here. So we have this condition, or if this condition is true, so if the username, let's say, contains 1 letter, this will be valid. But then I'm gonna check here to see if this is smaller than 2. It's the character that I don't need. So again, if it goes into the second condition, it checks the second case is true, then we're gonna get invalid username. So again, let's go to Postman, make sure that this is working properly. So username already taken, perfect. Let's test it with 2 characters. So it says created, so all our validation has been successful. Let's try a single character. It's gonna say invalid username. Let's try simply something empty. It's gonna say invalid username. Let's remove it altogether. It's gonna say invalid username. Okay, so now we have some basic username validation here at this point. So we are kind of like confident that the username is okay-ish. It's not perfect, but is okay, right? Good. Now you have seen here previously, I've used the same email multiple times. So if looking now in the database, we'll be able to see that there are multiple emails in the database, multiple emails. This is actually multiple users with the same email in the database. And this is again something from the validation standpoint that we don't want to have. So what we have to do, well, it's kind of like similar to what we did here before. So we have to validate the email. So I'm gonna copy this block. So validate email. Let's check for an existing email. Again, we're gonna look into the users, and what I'm gonna search for, I'm gonna search for the email. And let's see if the new user has eventually the same email. And we can say email already registered. And we're still returning a 400. The application has been deployed. Jumping back into Postman. Invalid username. Okay, probably I should use here a valid username right now. So I'm gonna use a nice Postman functionality, random, let's say first name, or do we have something random? Username. Perfect. We have a random username from Postman, so we don't have to worry about it. And now what we're getting back is created. Let's try it again. So we're still getting back created. So there's still an error somewhere in our code. And we're checking here, we started with existing email and we're still using existing user. So this should be existing email here. Okay, and we're getting back email already registered. Status 400 bad request. It's all good, right? The second problem with this is that this shouldn't be a valid email, right? So, okay, John Doe, we've already tried it out, but you know, I can essentially add here anything in the email and that's not gonna be a valid email. So for that reason, we still have to do a bit of validation. And actually validating an email address is by no means an easy task. There was like this library that found at one point. So let's go to our package.json. We're gonna add here package. I'm gonna use here email validator. So it's called here email validator, right? So we're adding this new package. You'll see it here. And we also have to import it. So essentially we're going to use this library as a way to validate our emails. And this is essentially the power in these libraries. We don't need to write everything from scratch. We can just add some libraries to our code. If they're known in the community, and if we're not just adding some packages that maybe contain malicious code and can compromise our application. But there are a lot of very, very well maintained and decent packages out there with code, and that will save us a lot of time. So let's go ahead and import this as well. I'm gonna call it email validator, and I'm gonna import it from, I think it's email validator, right? Just want to make sure I don't make any mistakes at this point. I'm gonna give it a few seconds. So in our code, what do we need to do? Well, first of all, probably it does make sense to, first of all, essentially validate the email. So I'm gonna write here another if condition, and we can use the email validator dot validate. So we can provide here the email. So before we do anything with it, just want to make sure that the email itself is valid, right? Otherwise, it doesn't really make sense to search in the database and things like that. So we're gonna negate this. So if the email is not valid, this will return true or false. I'm gonna send back again 400 invalid email. So let's see if this works as expected. Invalid email. All right. So let's try and trick it into thinking it's valid. No. And now we're getting back the error email already registered. Perfect. So what we can do at this point is essentially we can enable these users to get back to write this data to the database and to get back a successful message. Actually, what we tend to do a lot is for this kind of data when we're creating something is to return a status 201 instead of a status 200. So we can do that like this: response.status, and right here 201. Oh my god. And we can also add here a random email. Random example email. Why isn't this showing up? Random example email. Okay, 201 created. Now, as you have seen with this endpoint, we haven't specified like a password. And normally when you go to a website, if you go to Twitter, you select a username, find a valid username that hasn't been registered so far, and you'll also find you will give a password. Now, quite often with APIs, we do use credentials, but we don't use username and passwords. We typically use tokens. Now, tokens are in some regards also pretty similar to a password, but it's something that's a bit, it's decoupled from when you're sending it over. It just guarantees access to an API essentially. And they are quite often being used for API authentication. So essentially you're getting a token and then the API is just validating this token to see if it's essentially valid. And then it's sending that token over to the client. Not actually sending to the client, it's giving it to the client initially, and then other endpoints can validate if that token is valid. So in order to really simplify how our authentication works here, what we want to send back is an access token. So it's essentially the client has given us a username, has given us an email, and we're generating like a password, and we're saying, okay, you can create tweets, you can go to any of these endpoints. You don't need to provide your username, you don't need to provide your email or anything like that. Just provide this token. And because you were the first one who was registered with this username and with this email, you're the only one who knows the token. Otherwise, if you're just saying, hey, I'm John Doe and I have this email, would be hard for the API to verify. So this is why using a token is an interesting idea. Now, the thing is, like, how do we generate a token? Now, token is essentially some random data, right? That is being sent, and most of the time this is somehow encoded, so it doesn't contain some weird characters or something like that. So there is a very nice library that I like using, and because we don't have a database that can really generate IDs and things like that, we need to somehow randomly generate some data, right? So this library that I wanted to use here is called NanoID. So it's a unique string ID generator. So we can also take a look here at the docs. I'm gonna simply install it. So when we're using this, we can simply import it. So this is probably the next thing that we need to do. Let's go in our script, import it here. And if we're looking here at the usage, we simply have to call NanoID as a function when we're getting this back. All right. So this theoretically could now be our password. So this is randomly generating all the time. We are assigning it to the client, so we could somehow verify that this is indeed valid. So let's see the full docs, if there are also other variants that we could use for this. So you can see here that maybe there are also, let's see, custom alphabet size, blocking, security. We can also specify a size, but it's gonna probably lead to IDs colluding. So we're gonna assign the same ID to multiple persons. All right, so let's jump back into our code, and we have to essentially provide this information. We have to store it here somewhere. So we have to associate this password. So let's call this access. So we have to associate the access token with the user, right? So we're gonna add it here as part of the new user. What was the function? This was the function. So we have here the access token. And if all validations are passing, probably the best thing would be to, instead of saying here created, we can say here access token. We can simply provide an access token that has been created here. So it's gonna be from new user dot access token. So then the user will know this access token, we will know this access token, and this is the secret that's gonna be shared only between us and the user. So let's see if we're getting this access token back. And now we have here an access token 201 created. So this is the password that we can use. Now, what's happening most of the time is that you could also go ahead and use SHA, for example, to let's say to encrypt it or to calculate a hash from this, and to essentially get rid of any weird characters that you may see inside here. But at least for what we're trying to do right now, this is absolutely fine. So this is a good enough example for what we want to do. All right, so at least this endpoint is now working properly. We have some validation in it. We are generating this random password here, and we're sending it to the user who has registered. And now the idea would be to go to the tweets endpoint and to again add some validation here, right? And essentially this validation is not so easy, but again we're gonna start by thinking about the API design, thinking like how do we want to get this data, and the best way to get this data would be to go here, let's say create tweet. And the way we want to use it is we want to provide here authorization, and we're going to use as an authorization the bearer token, right? So we're going to have here bearer token. Let me copy this one from here. So we're going to send this over as an authorization header. You will see it here under the hidden headers that Postman has, and see here bearer space, and this is the token. Okay, so in terms of the tweets, let's we can currently disable writing any tweets here, because the first item on the agenda would be to verify if the user is actually logged in and allowed to submit this tweet, right? And essentially here the user, this is something that I don't even want to ask the user for the username. I'm just interested essentially in the message. So I don't want to have the user tell me like what is the username. I can simply remove this altogether from the possibilities. I'm gonna generate it from the information that I already have in the database, and I'm just gonna leave here the message. But we still need to verify, like, is this user allowed to post a message altogether? So what we have to do here is create a new block, and we're gonna put some conditions inside here, inside the if block, and pretty similar to registering a user, we're gonna return like some information. So the status that we are typically getting if we're not authenticated is 401. So 401 means unauthorized. You're not authorized to use this endpoint. You cannot create tweets if you don't provide us essentially with this password, right? So in that case, that makes total sense. And then let's say we can say something like missing or invalid bearer token. So we're not gonna go too much into like what's the problem with this, but if something fails, so I'm gonna put it here like if false, just to give it a try, just to see how this API feels. So if you don't send something, you're gonna get back this error message, right? Register user. Oh, create tweet. What am I doing here? And again, you'll see here what's happening if you forget to add a return. Oh, I added a return. Oh, if false. Oh my god, this is so embarrassing. So if true, if this evaluates true, can't believe it. We're gonna get back here 401 unauthorized, and the message will be missing or invalid bearer token, right? So we need to find here a way to see if this user is authenticated or not. So what I would propose in this case is to create a function. So let's go ahead and also experiment with writing some functions in JavaScript. So the way we define a function is simply writing function, and we can say, we can create it like question is authenticated, right? So this function will return here something, right? And we can simply call it like is authenticated false. Whenever trying something, it's always good to make baby steps and not to do too much at a time, just to understand like how the code is working and maybe catch some of the mistakes that you're doing. So for example, here is authenticated. If it's false, then actually I would expect to get into this error, so I have to negate this. So if it's not authenticated, then do this. So at this point, again, going back, So I've tested essentially the scenario. I've already tested my code and I haven't written essentially a lot of information here. So yeah. Now, how do we develop this function? We need to read this information. So in order to be able to read information, we need to have access to the request. So one parameter that we need to pass to this function here is authenticating, is the request. And we're gonna get here as a parameter as well. So we can also take a look at this. So whenever you're unsure about something, just use console.log and log this. Now for the request information, it's gonna be a lot of information here. So we can just go into the header, right? So this will just give us information about the header. So we could see the headers there. So let's see if this is working. So we know that we're sending a header here. Function header. Let's see, maybe I still have to get all the data. Maybe it's headers, I don't remember. Sometimes it's good when I don't remember everything, because we have to scroll through all this data. We can also look for the bearer. So we'll see here, this is the token that we're looking for, and it's available in headers. Excuse me for 1 second. All right, so let's go to the headers. I'm a bit lost into this code here. So request.headers. And what's the name of the header? It's probably authorization, right? So we can check if we're getting this information here directly. So we can see the information here. Probably header is a function that takes this as a parameter, but we don't have to worry about this too much. So we're seeing this information here. So we're just going to define here a variable called auth, and actually the auth header, right? So this is the auth header here. So this should contain something. We could also see what's happening if we're not sending this header altogether. So this would also be an interesting way. We'll test it later. But essentially what we're trying to do here is, again, to do a search in the database, right? So in order to do a search in the database, so we're gonna check here for essentially existing user. This already looks pretty decent. So I'm gonna simply copy that from there. And from the auth header, now we still need to do something. You'll see here that it contains also this word bearer and space. So you know that's a bit annoying. So we could essentially do something like, let's create here let auth header. We could use here replace, and with replace we can do a replacement. So we have to specify what are we searching for. So we're searching for bearer space, and we're gonna replace it with an empty space. So maybe that's one way to go. And maybe let's define this as access token, right? So we can define this as a access token. We can keep the auth header as a constant. And what we can do here is search for the access token in the database. Right. So if we are finding something in a database, well, we're finding the user, right? So, and we know that we already need a username. So essentially, we could also repurpose this function and to get all this data at once. So let's see how this could look like. So for example, let's say here, get user by access token, right? So this could be one way to formulate it, and we can simply return here the user. So that would be like one way to handle this. And here we can try the same thing. So if this is false, essentially, if there's no user, then we can say, you know, missing or invalid bearer token. Otherwise, let's define here a variable. So let's say if no user, we can use this function because we need it later on. So I'm going to replace it from here. So if there's no user, for one, if we do have a user, maybe try and get here the username, right? User.username. It's probably going to be a good thing to just change it in the database as well. And of course, if something is not working properly, we can always log the information that we're finding here. So we can use here console.log, new tweet. So let's see if this works or fails altogether. So cannot read property replace of undefined. So obviously we haven't executed this code in a long time here. So at this point here, for some reason, it's obvious the fact that this token doesn't exist here. So at this point, we still need to do like an additional check. So we could try something like if auth header. So if there's no auth header, we can simply create here a return block. I'm not going to return anything, right? So just a small validation at this point. If we don't have this, we're going to return essentially thing undefined here. Okay, so I'm going to get here missing or invalid bearer token. This is essentially what we expected, so our code is not failing. We now have a bearer token here. We're sending it over, and we have here the username information and the message. So we are pretty comfortable now with actually saving this information here in the database. So essentially double purpose. We are trying to get this user based on the access token provided. If we cannot get that user doesn't exist, or the access token is somehow invalid, we can also, like, just to be sure, let's add something here to this access token. So you'll see it's not something that's available in the database, so it's failing. And then obviously all the tweets that we have here at this point will be added with this username. So that's essentially it. So as you have seen, this registration part and validating the bearer token, it's not really trivial. It's not impossible, but I can assure you that this application is not bulletproof from the validation point of view. And I just wanted you to get really the complexity around this, just to see like really how hard it is to get this to run. Now we're coming pretty close to the end of this, but I still wanted to show you a tool. And what's happening at this point is we really started like from the basics. We started with a simple endpoint, right? And then we looked into, okay, how can we create a post request? Then we understood, okay, we need validation, we need user registration and so on. So we added those to the API as well. So let's say at this point, we have an API that is working out there. Yeah, so we have deployed it. We have used now Postman to test it. We haven't written any tests, and we haven't added anything in that regards. But of course, we could do that as well. And just to ensure that, you know, whenever we're making changes to this API, maybe create a pipeline somewhere or create a Postman monitor, constantly go over that API to make sure that everything that we have here is working properly. So that would be like one thing that we could add additionally. Of course, there are many other endpoints that could be added, but once you understand how to do a get, how to do a post, it's going to be pretty easy also to do a delete or to do something else. But that's maybe the topic for another tutorial. Still, what I wanted to show you is a monitoring tool. So the idea here is once you deploy an API and you let essentially other people use it, it's no longer under your control, like how people use your API. And in order to close this feedback loop and to understand like what is your API doing, how are people using it, like what kind of errors appear there. To understand something like this, there are different tools that can monitor your API from how it's being used. And one of the tools that I've discovered recently is Treble. And it is, I would say from the beginning, it is ideal for people just getting started with APIs and people having an API and trying to understand like how to use it and how others use that API. And this is a piece of software that is embedded essentially in your application, and it sends data to the Treble servers, and they will be able to provide you with some analytics in terms of what is your API doing. So I'm gonna go here to the dashboard. I already have an account, but if you don't have an account, there you can get started for free. So the free plan, it contains all the features that you need from the product. It's super easy to use. It allows you to retrieve 5,000 requests, and for 14 days those requests will be there. So once you have published your API somewhere, do some monitoring, check like how is this API being used, check if there are any issues with it. So after creating an account, which is super easy, go to the dashboard, go here and create a new project. So I'm gonna call this project Twitter clone. Right, this is the name of the project. Let's see where the URL of this project is. Sometimes I do forget. Let me check in Postman. So I'm gonna simply go to the variables, copy this, finish and save project. Okay, so in order to integrate our API with Treble, what we need to do here is to add essentially a library, just as we've done with other things. Now, this is not a PHP project, this is a Node project. So what we need to do here is to use here Treble. So I'm gonna go to the application. Let's see here, package, and a package. I'm gonna give it a few seconds to load. And let's go back and see what's needed here. So there are a few credentials here that you will see. So these are essentially, again, some API keys that your application needs in order to connect with Treble. We first have also to require using it. So I'm gonna also do an import here. Let's go ahead. I'm gonna use here import. This import syntax is a bit different from the require syntax, but still pretty similar in concept, as long as it's working and not making a fool of myself. And what we have here, we already have this Express app that you see, so that has been added here. And we also have Express.json, so all we have to do here is attach this to our code. Now we can use some variables, kind of later on remove them from here, but just want to demonstrate like how this is working. So I'm attaching this information here, and let's go back to the API and see if it's still working properly. So I'm getting back 200, so that's good. Now, typically what's happening is like as soon as some requests are being sent, getting here the tweets. Let's create a few tweets. So I'm gonna pretend to be using some data here. Let's create here some invalid emails. So let's also do some no auth for the create tweet. And what typically happens is that in a few moments this data is being sent and should appear here, but if it's not being sent, then we have to take a look at the logs and see what's happening. Maybe there's something that I forgot to do. That's also possible. So let's send over a request. So use treble. Maybe there's something. Ah, there you go. Phew, I was scared for a second. Last time I tried it out, it was like instantly there, but this time it needed a few seconds. So it's kind of like the interesting thing about this tool. Like as soon as you put some data to it, it will show you like what's going on here and how is this data being sent. You will see here, for example, which endpoints this API has, how many requests have been sent to each API. If there are like any problems, there's like an instant documentation that's being generated for different endpoints that are available. And there's also like some analytics and things. But what I find quite interesting is like right from the beginning, you have an idea like what's happening with your API. And you will see here some data being pushed. So yeah, super useful for monitoring your API and understanding like what's happening. And also, if there are any problems with the API, they will be reported here, so you can take a look into them and see how that is working. So guys, this has been essentially the stream for today. We went a bit over 1 hour, but I definitely wanted to show you this part with the user registration. The authentication part, which is kind of a dependent on the registration itself. We also went a bit into data validation and understood that it's really not an easy topic and something that shouldn't be underestimated. And a bit to complete like this API development cycle, we also went a bit into monitoring, and I've showed you this treble tool. It's really easy to use for beginners, and I highly recommend that you take a look into it, especially like for very small projects, especially if you're in the beginning, like just trying to work with an API. It's a very nice tool. All right. As always, thank you for sticking until the end. I hope this video, this tutorial has been useful. If that was the case, consider giving it a thumbs up. Subscribe to this channel for more tutorials like this, and let me know in the comments section, how was it? Was it useful? Did you learn something new? Are there any other topics in terms of developing an API that would be interesting, so that I can create other tutorials and serve you better? Thank you all for watching, and I will see you next time.